What's in the bag? And don't play dumb with me. The morning briefing room at the FBI field office hummed with quiet intensity as Special Agent Jerome Washington reviewed the thick case file spread across the conference table. Financial crimes weren't glamorous work, but they were necessary work, the kind that dismantled criminal networks one transaction at a time. The manila folder contained months of surveillance photos, bank records, and intercepted communications, all pointing to the same conclusion. First National Bank downtown had become a hub for sophisticated money laundering operations. Jerome's supervisor, Agent Patricia Hayes, stood at the front of the room, pointing to surveillance photos taped to the whiteboard. "The pattern is consistent," she explained to the assembled task force. "Every Tuesday and Thursday between noon and 2 p.m., we see structured deposits just under the reporting threshold. The amounts vary, but the timing doesn't. Someone's moving dirty money through legitimate channels and they're good at it. The operation required finesse. Too much surveillance presence would spook the network. Too little, and they'd miss the key players." Jerome had volunteered for the most delicate part of the assignment, solo surveillance from a public position directly across from the bank's main entrance. It meant hours of sitting still, looking casual while maintaining perfect vigilance. At 39, Jerome had learned patience the hard way. Growing up in Detroit, he'd been stopped by police 17 times before his 18th birthday, each encounter teaching him something about staying calm under pressure. Those experiences had driven him to law enforcement, but from the federal side where he could make a difference in how justice actually worked. His encrypted phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Daddy, when are you coming home from your work trip?" Zara, age 8, had inherited her mother's directness and her father's persistence. Jerome smiled despite the weight of the assignment ahead. Work trip was their code for undercover operations, something they'd developed after Carmen died 3 years ago. Zara understood that Daddy's job was important, but couldn't know the details. He typed back quickly. "Soon, baby bird. Be good for Mrs. Henderson." The babysitter was reliable, but Jerome still felt the familiar pang of single parenthood. Every operation meant time away from the person who mattered most, but also meant building a safer world for her to grow up in. The preparation was methodical. Civilian clothes that suggested business casual, but nothing too formal for someone sitting on a public bench. The leather messenger bag contained surveillance equipment disguised as everyday items, a camera lens built into a coffee thermos recording devices that looked like phone chargers, encrypted communication gear masked as tablets. Everything legal, everything authorized, everything designed to blend seamlessly into the urban landscape. Driving through the financial district toward his position, Jerome mentally rehearsed the operation parameters. Maintain visual contact with the bank entrance. Document any suspicious patterns. Identify potential couriers or facilitators. Most importantly, stay invisible. The best surveillance was the kind that went completely unnoticed by targets and bystanders alike. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest challenge might not be staying hidden from criminals, but staying safe from assumptions. A black man sitting alone near a bank with a bag would draw attention he didn't want from people who weren't part of his investigation. But that was a bridge he'd cross when he came to it. For now, the mission was everything. The financial district at midday moved with the predictable rhythm of commerce. Glass towers reflected autumn sunlight, while streams of professionals moved between meetings, lunch appointments, and coffee breaks. Jerome parked 3 blocks away and walked casually toward his surveillance position, the messenger bag hanging naturally from his shoulder. The bench he'd selected during reconnaissance sat directly across from First National Bank's main entrance, positioned perfectly to observe foot traffic without appearing obvious. It was public space, unremarkable, the kind of spot where someone might sit to check their phone or eat lunch. Jerome settled into position with practiced ease, placing the bag upright beside his leg where the concealed camera had an unobstructed view. From his perspective, the bank's glass doors opened and closed in steady intervals. Customers entered and exited in patterns he'd already begun to memorize from previous surveillance. The lunch rush brought heavier traffic, but also provided cover for the kind of quick transactions the money laundering network preferred. Jerome checked his encrypted phone, scrolling through routine messages while actually monitoring the communication channel with his surveillance team. Agent Collins was positioned inside the bank as a customer. Agent Martinez watched from a coffee shop 2 blocks south. They were invisible threads in a web designed to catch financial criminals who thought they were smarter than federal law enforcement. 15 minutes into the surveillance, Jerome noticed the normal patterns. A delivery truck arrived precisely at 12:15, the same time it had appeared in previous surveillance photos. 3 customers entered together, split up inside, then exited separately. These weren't coincidences in financial crimes investigation. They were signatures. The pedestrian traffic around his bench flowed naturally. Business people walked past without giving him a second glance. A jogger paused nearby to stretch, then continued her route. 2 construction workers shared a cigarette at the corner before returning to their job site. This was exactly how surveillance was supposed to work, completely unremarkable. Jerome's trained eye caught movement that didn't fit the patterns. A dark sedan had been circling the same 3-block radius for the past 10 minutes, neither parking nor leaving the area. The windows were tinted just dark enough to obscure passengers, but light enough to avoid drawing police attention. He made a mental note of the license plate and continued his patient observation. The bank's security guard emerged for his scheduled break, another pattern Jerome had documented. In financial crimes, timing was everything. The money laundering networks they were tracking operated with clockwork precision, exploiting the tiny windows when normal security routines created opportunities. A patrol car passed slowly down the street, and Jerome felt the familiar tension that came with being a black man in public space. He kept his posture relaxed, his expression neutral, his movements casual. The car continued without stopping, but Jerome noticed it in his peripheral vision making a U-turn at the next intersection. The encrypted phone buzzed with an update from Collins inside the bank. Unusual activity at teller station 3. Customer made large cash deposit, left immediately without waiting for receipt. Jerome typed back acknowledgement while appearing to check regular messages. These were the moments when months of investigation crystallized into actionable intelligence. But as the patrol car made another slow pass, Jerome realized his biggest challenge wasn't going to be catching financial criminals. It was going to be staying focused on his mission, while dealing with the assumptions of local law enforcement who saw a black man with a bag sitting near a bank. The patrol car eased to the curb with deliberate slowness, engine ticking, as it cooled in the afternoon air. Jerome kept his attention focused on the bank entrance, though every instinct told him the approaching footsteps belonged to someone who'd already decided he didn't belong there. Officer Trent Blackwood stepped out of the vehicle with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. At 34, his platinum blonde hair was cut military short, and his uniform pressed to razor-sharp creases. The body camera on his chest activated automatically as he approached, capturing everything that was about to unfold. "What's in the bag?" Blackwood's first words carried no introduction, no pleasantries, just immediate suspicion wrapped in a command that assumed guilt before establishing facts. Jerome looked up calmly, his expression neutral despite the familiar surge of frustration that came with being approached this way. "Personal belongings," he replied evenly, his voice carrying just enough courtesy to avoid escalation while maintaining his dignity. Blackwood shifted his stance, hand resting casually near his belt in a gesture designed to project authority. "That's vague," he said, studying Jerome's face for signs of nervousness or deception. "You've been sitting here for 20 minutes now? Waiting for something?" "About 15 minutes," Jerome corrected mildly. "Waiting for a meeting." The truth, though, not the complete truth. His meeting was with surveillance subjects who didn't know they were being watched. Funny how it's always your type sitting this close to a bank with a bag. Blackwood said the words landing with unmistakable meaning. Not subtle, not coded, but direct enough to make his assumptions clear. Jerome tilted his head slightly, maintaining eye contact. "My type?" he asked, though he already knew exactly what the officer meant. Sometimes forcing people to say their bias out loud was the only way to make them hear it. "You heard me," Blackwood replied, glancing toward the bank entrance and then back to Jerome's messenger bag. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. A few pedestrians had begun to slow their pace, sensing the tension without understanding its source. A woman in a business suit paused to adjust her phone case while clearly listening. An elderly man walking his dog stopped to let the animal investigate a fire hydrant that suddenly seemed very interesting. The everyday rhythm of the financial district was starting to bend around the confrontation developing on the sidewalk. Jerome remained seated, his posture relaxed but alert. "This is a public bench," he said calmly. "I'm not breaking any laws by sitting here." With a bag, Blackwood pressed his voice, gaining an edge. "Watching the bank." "I checked my phone twice," Jerome replied. "That's not the same as watching anything." Blackwood stepped closer, using his height to create physical pressure. "Don't play games with me. I know suspicious behavior when I see it, and you're exhibiting all the classic signs." Jerome's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "And what signs are those? Mail alone bag positioned with clear sight lines to a financial institution," Blackwood recited as if reading from a training manual. "You want to tell me that's coincidence? I want to tell you that sitting on a public bench isn't a crime," Jerome replied. "But I'm starting to think you've already decided what this conversation is about." The words carried more weight than their surface meaning. Jerome had been in this position before, though never while conducting federal surveillance. The script was always the same assumption escalation demand for compliance with requests that exceeded legal authority. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Stand up," he ordered, his tone shifting from suspicious to commanding. Jerome complied slowly, rising from the bench with his hands visible and his movements deliberate. The messenger bag remained where he'd placed it, though Blackwood's attention stayed fixed on it like a magnet. "You got ID?" Blackwood asked, though it sounded less like a question than a demand. "Yes," Jerome replied simply, not volunteering to produce it without being asked directly. "Let me see it." Jerome reached slowly into his jacket pocket, producing his wallet with careful movements designed not to alarm. He handed over his driver's license, which showed his real name and address, but nothing about his federal employment. Blackwood studied the ID, comparing the photo to Jerome's face with theatrical suspicion. "Jerome Washington," he read aloud. "Detroit address, long way from home. I travel for work," Jerome explained. "What kind of work? Government consultation," Jerome replied, which was technically accurate if incomplete. Blackwood handed the license back with obvious reluctance. "Government consultation," he repeated skeptically. "And that requires sitting outside banks with bags." The conversation was spiraling exactly where Jerome had hoped it wouldn't go. Every word was being recorded by the body camera, creating a permanent record of assumptions and accusations that had no basis in observable criminal behavior. But revealing his federal identity would compromise months of investigation, putting the entire operation at risk. Officer Jerome said carefully, "I understand you're doing your job, but I haven't violated any laws. I'm sitting on a public bench, which is legal. I have identification, which I've provided. What specific crime do you suspect me of committing?" Blackwood's expression hardened at being challenged. "I suspect you of casing this bank for a robbery," he said bluntly. "And now you're going to tell me exactly what's in that bag." The air between them thickened with tension as Blackwood's accusation hung in the space like a physical presence. Jerome felt the familiar calm that descended in moments of crisis, the mental clarity that came from years of training and too many encounters with exactly this kind of assumption. "You suspect me of planning a bank robbery," Jerome repeated, making sure the body camera captured both the accusation and his measured response. Based on what evidence, Blackwood's jaw tightened at being asked to justify his suspicion. Based on your behavior, your location, and the fact that you fit the profile, he said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd never been wrong about anything in his life. What profile is that? Jerome asked, though he already knew the answer would reveal more about the officer than any criminal investigation. Before Blackwood could respond, his radio crackled with dispatch communications. Jerome caught fragments of the conversation as Blackwood called for backup, describing the situation as suspicious individual, possible surveillance of financial institution, requesting additional units for support. The words backup and additional units shifted the dynamic immediately. What had been a conversation between two people was about to become a public spectacle involving multiple officers, patrol cars, and inevitably civilian observers with cell phone cameras. Jerome remained standing beside the bench, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, but his mind raced through the implications. Every additional officer meant more complications. Every civilian recording meant more public exposure. Every minute this continued meant less chance of salvaging the surveillance operation that had taken months to establish. You called backup. Jerome observed his tone neutral despite his growing frustration. I called support for a potential situation. Blackwood corrected, though the distinction seemed meaningless. Someone like you doesn't just sit outside a bank with a bag unless they're planning something. The phrase, someone like you, struck Jerome like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so casually deployed. 40 years of life had taught him that this particular combination of words always preceded trouble. And what exactly is someone like me, Jerome asked, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone that suggested the question wasn't rhetorical. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing his language was being recorded. Someone who doesn't belong in this area, he said, attempting to soften the original implication without abandoning it entirely. I don't belong on a public sidewalk, Jerome pressed. You don't belong sitting this close to a bank with a bag watching the entrance like you're timing something. Blackwood replied, his defensiveness growing more obvious. A second patrol car rounded the corner, moving slowly but purposefully toward their location. Jerome watched its approach with resignation. Each additional element transformed a manageable situation into something increasingly difficult to control. Officer Sarah Mills emerged from the second vehicle, her approach more cautious than Blackwood's had been. At 28, she'd been trained in de-escalation techniques that emphasized questions before accusations, though she could clearly see that Blackwood had already moved past that stage. What's the situation? Mills asked, directing the question to Blackwood while studying Jerome's posture and demeanor. Suspicious individual conducting possible surveillance of the bank, Blackwood reported formally. He's been sitting there for 20 minutes with a bag watching the entrance. Refuses to explain his presence or open the bag for inspection. Mills looked from Blackwood to Jerome, her expression suggesting she was processing more than just the words. Sir, she said to Jerome, could you help us understand what brings you to this location today? The difference in approach was immediately obvious. Mills had asked a question where Blackwood had made an accusation. She'd addressed Jerome as Sir, where Blackwood had avoided titles entirely. Small differences that suggested different training or different instincts about how to interact with citizens. I'm waiting for an appointment, Jerome replied, grateful for the opportunity to provide context rather than defend against assumptions. What kind of appointment? Mills continued. Business-related, Jerome said, which was accurate without being specific. Blackwood stepped forward impatiently. He's been evasive from the beginning, he interrupted. Won't explain? The bag won't explain why he chose this particular spot, keeps giving vague answers about everything. Mills held up a hand slightly, a subtle gesture suggesting Blackwood should let her continue the conversation. Sir, I understand your frustration with the questions, but we're trying to understand the situation. Could you help us by being a little more specific? Jerome appreciated Mills' approach. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. He couldn't reveal his federal status without compromising the investigation, but every moment of this confrontation was making that investigation more difficult to maintain. Officer Mills Jerome said, reading her name tag, "I'm sitting on a public bench waiting for an appointment. I haven't violated any laws, haven't threatened anyone, haven't displayed any weapons or made any aggressive moves. What specific criminal activity am I suspected of?" The question hung in the air as a third patrol car appeared at the end of the block. Jerome realized that Blackwood's call for backup had generated more response than expected, transforming their interaction into exactly the kind of public scene that would destroy any hope of continuing surveillance. "You're suspected of planning a bank robbery," Blackwood said bluntly, apparently deciding that directness was his best strategy. "And if you've got nothing to hide, you'll open that bag and clear this up right now." The gathering police presence had begun to attract civilian attention in the way that unexpected commotion always does in business districts. People emerged from buildings, slowed their walking pace, and pulled out phones to capture whatever was developing on the sidewalk across from First National Bank. Among the growing crowd of observers, 10-year-old Emma Rodriguez walked hand in hand with her grandmother Maria, returning from a dental appointment in one of the nearby office buildings. Emma had inherited her mother's curiosity and her father's sense of justice, along with the unfiltered directness that children possess before the world teaches them when to stay quiet. Abuela Emma said, tugging on her grandmother's sleeve as they approached the cluster of police cars. "Why are those policemen talking to that man? Did he do something bad?" Maria Rodriguez had lived through enough decades to recognize the particular tension that surrounded interactions between police and young black men. She tried to guide Emma around the scene, hoping to avoid the complications that came from a child's innocent questions in adult situations. "It's not our business," Mija Maria said, gently attempting to steer Emma toward the crosswalk that would take them away from the developing confrontation. But Emma had already focused on Jerome's face, reading something in his expression that the adults around her seemed to be missing. "He looks scared, Abuela. Why is he scared if he didn't do anything wrong?" The question carried clearly in the afternoon air, reaching Jerome and the officers despite Maria's efforts to keep Emma moving. Mills glanced toward the child, her expression softening slightly at the innocence of the observation. Emma pulled free from her grandmother's hand and took several steps closer to the police cars, her natural curiosity overriding the caution that adults had learned through experience. "Excuse me," Emma said, directing her question to Mills with the fearless directness that only children could manage. "Why are you being mean to that man?" "He's just sitting down." Mills crouched to Emma's eye level, recognizing that children's perspectives often cut through adult complications in ways that were both enlightening and uncomfortable. "We're not being mean, sweetheart. We're just asking him some questions." But why? Emma persisted. "My mom says police only ask questions when someone breaks the rules." What rules did he break? The question struck at the heart of the entire interaction with a precision that 40 minutes of adult conversation had failed to achieve. Mills found herself unable to provide a simple answer because there wasn't one. Blackwood stepped forward, his patience with civilian interference clearly wearing thin. "Little girl, you need to move along with your grandmother. This is police business." Emma tilted her head, studying Blackwood with the frank assessment that children used when adults weren't making sense. "But if he broke the rules, why isn't he in trouble yet? And if he didn't break the rules, why are you still asking him questions?" Maria Rodriguez approached quickly, apologizing in a mixture of English and Spanish while trying to collect her granddaughter. "I'm sorry, officers. Emma Venica, we need to go home." But Emma had one more question, the kind that children asked without understanding their power to reveal truth. Looking directly at Jerome, she said simply, "Are you okay, mister? You look sad." Jerome's chest tightened at the child's concern, at the simple human recognition of his dignity that the adults around her had seemed to forget. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he replied softly. "Thank you for asking." Emma nodded seriously, then turned back to the officers. My teacher says we should always be kind to people, especially when they look sad. Are you being kind? Mills felt heat rise in her cheeks as the child's question highlighted the disconnect between the official justification for their presence and the human reality of what was occurring. Blackwood's face hardened his discomfort with the situation manifesting as increased rigidity. Emma, please, Maria said, finally succeeding in taking her granddaughter's hand. We have to go. As they walked away, Emma called back over her shoulder. I hope you feel better, mister. And I hope the police start being nicer. The child's words hung in the air long after she disappeared into the crowd, creating a space where the adults present were forced to consider what they were actually doing and why they were doing it. Jerome felt a profound sadness settle over him, not for himself, but for the world that Emma would inherit. A world where a child's natural instinct for kindness and fairness would gradually be worn down by the complications adults created when they let fear and assumption guide their actions. Mills stood slowly, her expression thoughtful. For the first time since arriving at the scene, she seemed to be questioning whether their response was proportional to the situation they'd encountered. Blackwood, however, appeared to interpret the child's intervention as further evidence of manipulation. See how you people operate, he said to Jerome. Turn everything into a scene. Get civilians involved. Make us look like the bad guys. I didn't ask that child to notice this situation, Jerome replied quietly. She noticed it because it's noticeable. 3 police cars for a man sitting on a bench. You created the scene, officer. I was just sitting here. The truth of that observation was becoming harder to ignore as more pedestrians gathered at the edges of the interaction phones raised questions being whispered. The financial district's normal rhythm had been completely disrupted by a situation that had no clear legal justification and no obvious resolution. But Blackwood was too invested in his original assessment to back down, even as the evidence mounted that his suspicions were based on something other than actual criminal behavior. The arrival of a 3rd patrol car completed the transformation of a simple street interaction into the kind of public spectacle that local news crews would feature on evening broadcasts. Officer David Chen emerged from the vehicle with the measured caution of someone who'd been briefed that the situation was under control but could see clearly that it was anything but. The financial district's normal afternoon rhythm had given way to something resembling a street festival with office workers emerging from buildings to observe the unfolding drama. Cell phone cameras had multiplied, creating a forest of recording devices, capturing every word and gesture from multiple angles. Jerome watched the scene develop with growing resignation. 3 patrol cars, 4 officers, dozens of civilian observers, and social media posts that were probably already spreading across platforms with hashtags he could predict without seeing them. The surveillance operation he'd spent weeks preparing was not just compromised, it was destroyed. Sir Officer Chen said, approaching with more diplomatic language than Blackwood had employed, "Could you help us understand the situation? We've got reports of suspicious activity, and we're just trying to sort things out." Jerome appreciated Chen's tone, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. I've explained to your colleagues that I'm waiting for an appointment. I'm sitting on a public bench, which isn't illegal. I haven't threatened anyone, haven't displayed any weapons, haven't made any aggressive moves. Chen nodded, glancing toward Blackwood for context. And the bag contains personal belongings, Jerome replied, the same answer he'd given repeatedly. Blackwood stepped forward impatiently. He refuses to open it for inspection, claims it's personal property, but he won't explain why he's positioned himself with direct sightlines to the bank entrance. Chen studied the geography, noting the bench's position relative to the bank doors. From a tactical perspective, it was indeed an optimal surveillance location, though that fact alone didn't constitute probable cause for detention or search. Officer Chen Mills said quietly, drawing him aside for a brief conversation that Jerome couldn't hear but could see was generating some kind of disagreement between the responding officers. The crowd continued to grow, with pedestrians now openly pausing to watch rather than pretending to pass by casually. A food truck vendor had stopped his vehicle at the corner and was serving customers who wanted to eat while observing the drama. Someone had started a live stream, judging by the professional-looking phone setup being operated by a woman in her 20s. Jerome's encrypted phone buzzed with messages from his surveillance team. Agent Collins was requesting updates from inside the bank. Agent Martinez was asking if the operation should be aborted. His supervisor was demanding an explanation for why local police were creating a scene at their surveillance location. He couldn't respond to any of them without revealing his federal status, but every minute of silence was generating more questions from his team and more complications for an investigation that had taken months to develop. "Look," Jerome said, addressing Chen as the officer who seemed most interested in actual resolution. "I understand this appears unusual from your perspective, but I'm not required to explain my presence on public property. I've provided identification when requested. I haven't violated any laws." "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Chen considered the question carefully. "We're asking for your cooperation in resolving this situation peacefully." "And what would that cooperation look like?" Jerome asked. Blackwood answered before Chen could respond. "Open the bag, explain why you're here, and stop playing games with us." The word games struck Jerome as particularly unfair, given that he'd answered every question truthfully within the constraints of his cover identity. But Blackwood had clearly moved beyond seeking information and was now focused on asserting dominance. "I'm not playing games," Jerome replied. "I'm exercising my constitutional rights while trying to understand why sitting on a bench has generated this level of police response." Mills rejoined the conversation, her expression suggesting she'd reached some conclusions during her private discussion with Chen. "Sir, we appreciate your cooperation so far. But you have to understand that from our perspective, the combination of factors, the location, the bag, the extended time sitting in one spot creates reasonable suspicion that warrants investigation." Jerome nodded, recognizing that Mills was trying to find middle ground. "I understand your perspective, Officer Mills, but reasonable suspicion requires specific articulable facts suggesting criminal activity. What specific facts support suspicion that I'm planning to commit a crime?" The question forced all three officers to consider their actual observations versus their assumptions. Chen seemed particularly uncomfortable with the scrutiny, perhaps recognizing that their official justification was thinner than they'd initially believed. Blackwood, however, doubled down. "You fit the profile of someone planning a bank robbery. Male alone bag surveillance position, evasive answers." "Those aren't specific facts about my behavior," Jerome replied calmly. "Those are demographic characteristics and assumptions." The crowd around them had grown to the point where traffic was beginning to slow as drivers craned their necks to see what was happening. A security guard from the bank had emerged to observe the situation, adding another layer of institutional attention. Jerome realized that the situation had reached a point where resolution required either complete capitulation to unreasonable demands or revelation of his federal identity. Neither option was acceptable, but the choice was being forced by officers who seemed more interested in saving face than finding truth. The standoff had reached a critical mass, where forward movement required someone to fundamentally change their position. 3 officers, 1 civilian, dozens of witnesses, and a social media audience that was growing by the minute all waited for a resolution that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve peacefully. Jerome felt the weight of decision pressing down on him like physical force. Every instinct told him to protect the investigation that had consumed months of federal resources and planning. Every minute of continued confrontation made it less likely that surveillance could ever be reestablished at this location. But the alternative, continuing to submit to escalating demands based on racial profiling, was equally unacceptable, not just personally, but professionally. Federal agents couldn't allow local law enforcement to compromise investigations through biased assumptions regardless of the operational cost. Blackwood took a step closer to Jerome's position, his movement subtle but clearly intended to increase pressure. "This is your last chance to cooperate voluntarily," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone preparing to take action with or without consent. Cooperate with what, Jerome asked, though he could see where the interaction was heading. "You still haven't identified any specific criminal activity you suspect me of committing." "Bank robbery," Blackwood replied flatly. "Or preparation for bank robbery. The bag contains tools or weapons for that purpose." Jerome felt something shift inside him, a recognition that the situation had moved beyond rational discussion into something else entirely. Blackwood wasn't investigating anymore. He was justifying a conclusion he'd reached within the first 30 seconds of their interaction. Officer Blackwood Jerome said carefully, "Are you detaining me?" "I'm investigating suspicious activity," Blackwood replied, not quite answering the question. "That's not an answer." Jerome pressed. "Am I free to leave? Or am I being detained?" Chen and Mills exchanged glances, both recognizing the legal significance of the question. If Jerome was being detained, they needed probable cause. If he was free to leave, then his continued presence was voluntary, and their authority to search his belongings was severely limited. Blackwood seemed to realize the trap in the question, but was too committed to his position to back down. "You're not free to leave until we resolve this situation," he said. "Then, I'm being detained," Jerome stated clearly. "On what grounds?" The question hung in the air while Blackwood searched for language that would sound official without acknowledging the weakness of his actual evidence. "Suspicious activity consistent with planning a bank robbery," he finally said. Jerome nodded slowly, recognizing that they'd reached the point where legal precision mattered more than diplomatic solutions. "Officer Blackwood, I need to retrieve something from my jacket pocket that will clarify this situation." All three officers tensed immediately, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. The crowd sensed the escalation, with several people moving backward while others raised phones higher to capture whatever was about to happen. "Keep your hands visible," Mills commanded sharply. "What are you reaching for?" Chen demanded. Jerome moved his hand slowly toward his inside jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and clearly telegraphed. "Federal identification," he said calmly. Blackwood scoffed. "Right. Federal identification." Jerome's fingers touched the leather credential case that he'd hoped not to reveal. Once opened, it would end the confrontation, but also end any possibility of continuing the surveillance operation. Months of investigation would be compromised because of one officer's inability to distinguish between suspicion and prejudice. "I'm removing my credentials now," Jerome announced, withdrawing the leather case with careful, visible movements. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Cell phone cameras zoomed in on Jerome's hands as he opened the credential case to reveal the gold shield and federal identification inside. "Special Agent Jerome Washington," he said clearly, holding the credentials steady so all three officers could read them. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words landed like a physical blow, creating a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch much longer than the few seconds it actually lasted. Mills stepped back involuntarily. Chen's hand dropped away from his weapon. Blackwood stared at the credentials as if they might disappear if he looked hard enough. "That's not possible," Blackwood said finally. "Dispatch requesting verification on FBI. Dispatch requesting verification on FBI. Special Agent Jerome Washington badge number." He read the number directly from the credentials Jerome held. The radio crackled with acknowledgement, followed by several minutes of silence, while dispatch contacted federal authorities for confirmation. Jerome watched Blackwood's face during the waiting period, seeing the gradual recognition of how catastrophically wrong his assessment had been. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or poor communication. This was a federal agent being publicly profiled and detained while conducting an authorized investigation. The radio finally responded with confirmation that sent shockwaves through everyone present. Unit on scene, FBI verification confirms Special Agent Jerome Washington, Financial Crimes Task Force currently assigned to undercover surveillance operation in your area. Federal supervisor has been notified of situation. The silence that followed was deafening. The confirmation from dispatch created a ripple effect that spread through the crowd like a shockwave, with whispered conversations and urgent text messages conveying the magnitude of what had just been revealed. A federal agent conducting an undercover investigation had been detained and publicly exposed because of racial profiling. Mills was the first to speak, her voice tight with the recognition of professional disaster. "Sir, we had no way of knowing. No way of—" Jerome closed the credential case slowly, his expression revealing nothing of the frustration and disappointment coursing through him. "You had no way of knowing because you didn't ask," he replied calmly. "You assumed." Chen stepped back, creating physical distance from a situation that had suddenly become exponentially more complicated. Federal agents being interfered with during active investigations generated the kind of reports that ended careers and created headlines. Blackwood remained frozen, staring at the spot where Jerome's credentials had been displayed, as if still trying to process what he'd seen. The foundation of his certainty had been completely destroyed, leaving him with no framework for understanding what had actually occurred. What kind of surveillance operation? Mills asked, perhaps hoping that understanding the federal investigation might somehow mitigate the damage they'd caused. "Financial Crimes Task Force," Jerome explained, recognizing that some level of disclosure was now necessary. "Money laundering investigation focusing on this bank. I've been conducting surveillance from this position for weeks." The words hit the assembled officers like individual punches. Weeks of surveillance meant weeks of federal resources. It meant careful planning, authorized operations, and coordination with multiple agencies. All of it now compromised because of a confrontation based on assumptions rather than facts. The bag, Chen asked weakly. "Contains surveillance equipment," Jerome replied. "Authorized federal surveillance equipment for an ongoing investigation." Blackwood finally found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. "You could have identified yourself earlier." Jerome's gaze hardened slightly, the first crack in his professional composure. When you approached without introduction, when you demanded to know what was in my bag, when you called me your type, and said I didn't belong here." The questions struck home because they highlighted the progression of the confrontation. Blackwood had never asked who Jerome was. He'd only demanded justification for Jerome's presence based on racial assumptions. Mills cleared her throat, recognizing the need to begin damage control. "Agent Washington, we sincerely apologize for any interference with your investigation. We had no idea." "You had no idea because you didn't investigate," Jerome interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "You made assumptions based on my appearance and escalated from there." A black sedan pulled up at the curb, its arrival drawing attention from both the crowd and the officers present. Agent Patricia Hayes emerged from the passenger side, her expression suggesting that she'd been briefed on the situation during her drive to the location. Agent Washington Hayes said, approaching with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. "Status report." Jerome gestured toward the assembled officers. "Local law enforcement compromised the surveillance operation by detaining me based on racial profiling. 3 patrol cars, public confrontation, social media coverage. The investigation is blown." Hayes absorbed the information with the practiced calm of someone who'd seen similar situations before, though the waste of federal resources and the public nature of the exposure made this case particularly damaging. "Officers," Hayes said, addressing Mills, Chen, and Blackwood collectively, "I'm Supervisory Special Agent Hayes, FBI Financial Crimes Task Force. Agent Washington has been conducting authorized surveillance at this location as part of a months-long investigation into money laundering operations. She paused, letting the implications sink in. That investigation is now compromised due to your actions. We'll need to debrief this incident thoroughly. Blackwood finally spoke, his voice carrying a defensive edge. We were responding to suspicious behavior. We couldn't have known he was federal. Hayes studied Blackwood carefully, recognizing the type of officer who justified mistakes rather than learning from them. What specific behavior did you observe that suggested criminal activity? Blackwood hesitated, perhaps realizing for the first time that his justification would sound thin when stated officially. Subject was positioned with clear sight lines to a bank carrying a bag remaining in location for extended period. Those are observational details, Hayes replied. What behavior suggested criminal intent? The question hung unanswered because there hadn't been any behavior suggesting criminal intent. There had only been assumptions based on racial profiling assumptions that had destroyed a federal investigation and exposed those same assumptions to public scrutiny. Jerome watched the exchange with mixed emotions. Professional vindication at having his federal status confirmed, but profound sadness at the broader implications. If this could happen to a federal agent conducting authorized surveillance, what happened to ordinary citizens who didn't have badges to flash when confronted with similar assumptions? The crowd was beginning to disperse as the drama reached its resolution, but cell phone videos were already being uploaded to social media platforms with captions that would generate hundreds of thousands of views and thousands of comments about racial profiling and law enforcement. Within hours, the incident would be analyzed on news programs, discussed in police training seminars, and referenced in federal reports about local law enforcement cooperation. But for Jerome, standing on a sidewalk where his professional competence had been questioned because of his skin color, the broader implications mattered less than the immediate recognition of how much work remained to be done. The arrival of Agent Hayes had shifted the dynamic, completely transforming what had been a confrontation between local police and a citizen into an official federal incident requiring documentation investigation and institutional response. The crowd sensed the change, with most observers beginning to disperse, while a few determined social media creators continued recording for content that would generate significant engagement. Hayes pulled out a tablet, beginning the documentation process that would create an official record of how a months-long federal investigation had been compromised. Agent Washington walked me through the timeline from initial contact to present. Jerome provided a concise but thorough account of the interaction from Blackwood's opening demand to know what was in his bag through the escalation to 3 patrol cars and the eventual revelation of his federal identity. Hayes took notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific quotes and timing. Officer Blackwood Hayes continued. Your body camera recorded this entire interaction. Blackwood nodded reluctantly, perhaps beginning to realize that his own equipment had created a permanent record of every biased assumption and inappropriate escalation. We'll need that footage as part of our incident report, Hayes said, along with recordings from all officers present and statements from any witnesses who observed the interaction. Mills stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to demonstrate cooperation. Ma'am, we'll provide full cooperation with your investigation. This was clearly a misunderstanding. Hayes raised an eyebrow at the word choice. Officer Mills, was it a misunderstanding when your colleague used the phrase, your type, to describe Agent Washington? Was it a misunderstanding when he stated that Agent Washington didn't belong in this area? The questions forced Mills to confront the reality that this wasn't about poor communication or insufficient information. This was about racial profiling that had been captured on camera and witnessed by dozens of civilians. Jerome felt his encrypted phone buzzing with messages from his surveillance team, who were probably watching social media posts about the incident and trying to understand what had happened to their operation. The coordinated surveillance network they'd spent weeks establishing was completely blown, with no possibility of reestablishing cover at this location. The investigation was tracking a money laundering network that moves approximately $2 million per month through structured transactions, Jerome explained to Hayes. We were scheduled to intercept a courier drop this afternoon. That operation is now impossible to complete. Hayes absorbed the financial scope of what had been lost, recognizing that the cost of Blackwood's assumptions extended far beyond hurt feelings or embarrassment. Federal resources, months of planning, and the opportunity to dismantle a significant criminal operation had all been sacrificed to one officer's racial bias. Chen cleared his throat nervously. "Agent Hayes, what happens now? To us, I mean." Hayes closed her tablet, having gathered enough preliminary information to begin the formal investigation process. "That depends on your department's response to this incident. The FBI will file a formal complaint with your supervisors, along with our complete case file documenting how Officer Blackwood's actions compromised a federal investigation." She paused, studying each officer's face. "We'll also be recommending a comprehensive review of your department's training procedures regarding racial profiling and interaction with federal agents conducting undercover operations." Blackwood finally found his voice, though it carried a defensive edge that suggested he still didn't fully grasp the magnitude of his error. "Agent Hayes, we were doing our jobs. We saw suspicious behavior and responded appropriately." Hayes turned to face him directly, her expression hardening. "Officer Blackwood, you saw a black man sitting on a bench and created an entire criminal narrative around his presence. That's not police work. That's prejudice." The blunt assessment hung in the air while Blackwood struggled to formulate a response that would justify his actions without acknowledging their racial motivation. Jerome felt a profound weariness settle over him, not from the confrontation itself, but from the recognition of how many similar interactions occurred daily without federal badges to change the outcome. How many citizens were subjected to the same assumptions, the same escalations, the same demands for compliance with requests that exceeded legal authority. Agent Washington Hayes said, "I need you to compile a complete report on the surveillance operation, including all intelligence gathered and any potential security compromises resulting from this incident." Jerome nodded, though he already knew the report would essentially document the complete destruction of months of investigative work. The money laundering network they'd been tracking would undoubtedly change their operations now that law enforcement attention had been publicly revealed. A news van pulled up at the corner, its satellite dish extending as a crew prepared to cover a story that was already trending on social media platforms. The incident had moved beyond a local police matter into the kind of public discourse about racial profiling that generated nationwide attention. Hayes noticed the news crew and sighed. "This is going to be a long day," she said to Jerome. "Are you prepared for media attention?" Jerome looked around at the scene: 3 patrol cars, multiple officers, federal agents, and civilian observers, all because he'd sat on a bench while black. "I don't think any of us were prepared for this," he replied. But as he watched Blackwood finally beginning to understand the implications of his actions, Jerome felt a flicker of something that might eventually become hope. Sometimes the only way to address unconscious bias was to force it into conscious recognition, even if that meant destroying federal investigations in the process. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the glass towers of the financial district, illuminating a sidewalk where assumptions had collided with reality, where prejudice had been exposed by the very cameras meant to protect police officers, and where a federal investigation had been sacrificed to teach a lesson that should never have needed teaching. But perhaps Jerome thought that was sometimes how change actually happened, not through policy manuals or sensitivity training, but through moments when the cost of bias became too obvious and too public to ignore. The internal affairs investigation began before the last patrol car had left the scene, with Blackwood's body camera footage being downloaded and analyzed by supervisors who recognized that the incident represented a potential liability nightmare for the department. Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed by the police chief, the mayor's office, and legal counsel who specialized in civil rights violations. Blackwood found himself sitting across from Internal Affairs investigator Captain Linda Rodriguez, watching his own actions played back on a monitor, with the sound turned up loud enough that every word he'd spoken was clearly audible. The phrases that had seemed justified in the moment your type don't belong. Planning something sounded different when removed from the heat of confrontation and examined under institutional scrutiny. "Officer Blackwood," Captain Rodriguez said, pausing the video at the moment when he'd used the phrase, "Someone like you helped me understand your thought process here. What did you mean by someone like you?" Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing that any honest answer would confirm racial profiling, while any evasive answer would suggest dishonesty during an official investigation. "I meant someone acting suspiciously in that location," he said finally. Rodriguez rewound the video slightly. "But you said someone like you before Agent Washington had done anything other than sit on a bench. What specifically about his appearance or behavior suggested criminal intent?" The question forced Blackwood to confront the timeline of his assumptions, recognizing that his suspicion had formed before any actual suspicious behavior had been observed. He'd seen a black man with a bag near a bank and built an entire criminal narrative around those basic facts. Meanwhile, Officers Mills and Chen were undergoing their own reviews, though their supervisors recognized that they'd arrived after Blackwood had already established the confrontational dynamic. Mills, in particular, had attempted de-escalation, though she'd ultimately supported Blackwood's position, rather than questioning it. Jerome returned to the FBI field office to find his surveillance team gathered around a conference table reviewing social media posts and news coverage of the incident. Agent Collins looked up as Jerome entered, his expression mixing sympathy with professional frustration. "The money laundering network changed their drop schedule," Collins reported. "Our contacts inside the bank say all the usual suspects called in sick today. They know we were watching." Jerome nodded, having expected this outcome. Criminal networks that had survived federal attention for months didn't ignore the kind of public exposure that had occurred on the sidewalk across from their target bank. Agent Martinez pulled up a news article on her laptop. "The story's gone national," she said. "FBI agent racially profiled while conducting undercover surveillance. The Department of Justice is already getting calls from civil rights organizations." Supervisor Hayes entered the conference room carrying a stack of incident reports and federal forms that would document the official response to the situation. "Agent Washington, I need you to walk the team through exactly what intelligence was compromised and what aspects of the investigation can be salvaged." For the next 2 hours, Jerome detailed the months of surveillance that had identified patterns, timing, and personnel involved in the money laundering operation. Much of it was now useless since the public nature of the police confrontation had revealed federal interest in the location. "What about prosecution of cases we'd already built?" Agent Collins asked. Hayes consulted her notes. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is reviewing whether any evidence might be challenged based on the circumstances of today's incident. Defense attorneys love arguing that investigations were motivated by racial bias rather than legitimate law enforcement." Jerome felt the weight of that possibility settling on him like a physical presence. Not only had months of future investigation been compromised, but past work might also be called into question because of one officer's inability to separate suspicion from prejudice. That evening, Jerome sat at his kitchen table helping 8-year-old Zara with her homework while the news played quietly in the background. A brief segment about the incident appeared between stories about city budget negotiations and high school sports scores. "Daddy," Zara said, looking up from her math worksheet, "Mrs. Henderson said you were on TV today. Were you famous?" Jerome considered how to explain the situation to his daughter without burdening her with the full weight of what had occurred. "Sometimes when people do important work, other people notice," he said carefully. "Good noticing or bad noticing?" Zara asked with the directness that 8-year-olds applied to complex situations. "A little of both." "Baby bird," Jerome replied. Sometimes when we do the right thing, it causes problems that help other people learn. Zara accepted this explanation and returned to her math problems, leaving Jerome to contemplate the broader implications of what had happened. How many similar confrontations occurred daily without federal badges to change the outcome? How many citizens endured the same assumptions, the same escalations, the same demands for compliance with requests that exceeded legal authority? 2 blocks away, Trent Blackwood sat in his own kitchen, administrative leave papers spread across the table, while his wife tried to understand how a routine day had resulted in suspension pending investigation. The body camera footage had been reviewed by federal authorities, civil rights organizations, and legal experts who specialized in police misconduct cases. "I was doing my job," Blackwood said to his wife for the 3rd time that evening, though the words sounded less convincing with each repetition. Maybe his wife replied quietly, "But maybe you need to think about how you chose to do it." The observation hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Blackwood wasn't ready to examine but couldn't completely ignore. For the first time since the confrontation, he found himself wondering not whether his actions had been legal, but whether they had been right. And in homes across the city, families watched news coverage and discussed what they'd seen, with children asking questions that parents struggled to answer about fairness, justice, and what it meant to belong in public spaces. 3 weeks after the incident, Jerome sat in a community center conference room that had been arranged with chairs in a circle rather than the confrontational rows typical of official meetings. The facilitated dialogue had been requested by civil rights organizations, supported by police reform advocates, and reluctantly agreed to by the police department as part of their response to the federal complaint. Professional mediator, Dr. Sarah Chen had extensive experience guiding conversations between law enforcement and community members, though she'd never mediated a case involving a federal agent being racially profiled. The unique circumstances required delicate handling of institutional relationships while addressing fundamental questions about bias and justice. Jerome arrived early, choosing a seat that allowed him to observe the room while remaining accessible to other participants. He'd agreed to the dialogue despite FBI policy discouraging agents from participating in public forums, recognizing that his federal status gave him protection that ordinary citizens didn't possess. Blackwood entered 10 minutes later, his appearance suggesting the strain of 3 weeks on administrative leave. The internal affairs investigation was ongoing, his future with the department uncertain, and his actions subject to federal review. He chose a seat directly across from Jerome, perhaps hoping to demonstrate that he wasn't intimidated by the process. Emma Rodriguez arrived with her grandmother Maria, the child's presence adding an element of innocence that immediately changed the room's dynamic. Emma had asked to attend after learning about the dialogue from news coverage, her 10-year-old sense of justice, insisting that she should be part of any conversation about fairness. "Welcome, everyone," Dr. Chen began. "We're here today because a moment of conflict has created an opportunity for understanding. This isn't a courtroom or an interrogation. It's a space for honest conversation about what happened, why it happened, and what we can learn from it." She gestured toward Emma. "I'd like to begin with our youngest participant because children often see things that adults miss. Emma, you were there that day." "What did you see?" Emma looked around the circle with the serious expression she reserved for important occasions. "I saw a nice man sitting on a bench looking sad because policemen were being mean to him for no reason," she said simply. The directness of the observation struck everyone present, summarizing the entire incident with a clarity that hours of official reports had failed to achieve. "What do you think should have happened differently?" Dr. Chen asked. Emma considered this carefully. The policeman should have said hello first. Like, "Hello, sir. I'm a policeman. Is everything okay?" Instead of being scary right away. Jerome felt his chest tighten at the child's instinctive understanding of basic human dignity. Emma had identified the core issue Blackwood had approached with accusations rather than questions, assumptions rather than curiosity. Dr. Chen turned to Blackwood. Officer Blackwood, how do you respond to Emma's observation? Blackwood shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with being questioned by a child about professional behavior. I was trained to be direct when investigating suspicious activity, he said carefully. But what made it suspicious, Emma pressed her question carrying the weight of absolute innocence. He was just sitting. The question hung in the air while Blackwood searched for an answer that would satisfy a 10-year-old's sense of logic. He couldn't explain racial profiling to a child because racial profiling couldn't be explained rationally. Jerome leaned forward slightly. Emma, can I share something with you? When I was about your age, maybe a little older, I had experiences like this too. People would see me and decide I didn't belong somewhere before they knew anything about me. Emma tilted her head, processing this information. That's not fair, she said firmly. No, Jerome agreed. It's not fair, and that's why conversations like this one are important. Dr. Chen guided the discussion toward deeper exploration of assumptions and their consequences. Officer Blackwood Agent Washington has shared that he experienced similar profiling as a child. How does that information affect your understanding of the impact your actions might have had? Blackwood looked directly at Jerome for the first time since entering the room. I didn't think about the impact, he admitted quietly. I thought about the threat I believed I was preventing. What threat? Emma asked immediately. Blackwood hesitated, recognizing that explaining his assumptions to a child would require acknowledging their irrationality. I thought he might be planning to rob the bank, he said, finally. Why? Emma persisted. Because... Blackwood began, then stopped, realizing that any honest answer would reveal the racial basis of his suspicion. Emma waited patiently for an explanation that would never come because there was no logical explanation for assumptions based on prejudice. Jerome felt a profound sadness for all the children like Emma, who would have their natural sense of fairness gradually eroded by a world that often operated on principles that couldn't be explained rationally to a 10-year-old. Officer Blackwood Jerome said quietly, "What would you do differently if you encountered a similar situation today?" Blackwood considered the question seriously, perhaps for the first time since the incident had occurred. "I would ask questions before making assumptions," he said slowly. "I would try to understand the situation before deciding what it meant." Emma nodded approvingly. "That's better," she said. "Questions are nicer than being scary." Dr. Chen looked around the circle. What else can we learn from this experience? Maria Rodriguez spoke for the first time, her heavily accented English carrying the authority of someone who'd observed decades of injustice. "We learn that children see truth more clearly than adults sometimes. Emma saw a man being treated unfairly, not a crime being prevented." Jerome nodded. "We learn that federal badges don't protect anyone from racial profiling. They just change the consequences afterward." Blackwood absorbed these observations, beginning to understand that his actions had been part of a much larger pattern that affected countless people who didn't have federal credentials to flash when confronted with biased assumptions. The dialogue continued for 2 more hours, covering topics that extended far beyond the specific incident to address broader questions about justice, fairness, and the responsibility everyone shared for creating communities where children like Emma could grow up believing that treating people fairly was normal rather than exceptional. When the session concluded, Emma approached Blackwood with the fearless directness that only children possessed. "Are you going to be nicer to people now?" she asked. Blackwood knelt to her eye level, perhaps recognizing that this child's opinion mattered more than any official review. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm going to try much harder to be nicer." Emma studied his face with the intensity children used when determining adult sincerity. "Good," she said finally. "Everyone deserves to be treated nicely." As participants gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Jerome felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition that understanding could emerge from even the most painful confrontations when people were willing to examine their assumptions honestly. The work of creating justice would continue one conversation at a time, guided by the moral clarity that children like Emma possessed naturally and that adults had to relearn through experience. 6 months after the sidewalk confrontation that had destroyed a federal investigation and exposed the reality of racial profiling in law enforcement, Jerome Washington stood before a packed auditorium at Jefferson High School, sharing a podium with someone he'd never expected to see again: former officer Trent Blackwood. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Blackwood had been terminated from the police force following the internal affairs investigation, but rather than disappearing into bitterness or denial, he'd chosen a different path. Extensive bias training, community service with civil rights organizations, and months of honest self-reflection had led him to a new understanding of how his assumptions had affected real people's lives. The joint presentation they were delivering had grown from a small community dialogue into a program that was being implemented in schools across 3 states, using their story to teach young people about the importance of questioning assumptions and treating all individuals with dignity. Students. Jerome began scanning the faces in the auditorium we're here today to talk about a moment when everything went wrong and what we learned from it. Blackwood stepped forward, his voice carrying none of the defensiveness that had characterized his responses 6 months earlier. I was a police officer who made decisions based on fear and assumptions instead of facts and fairness. Agent Washington was doing his job sitting on a public bench, and I decided he was a criminal because of how he looked. A student in the front row raised her hand. "Mr. Blackwood, weren't you trained not to do that?" Blackwood nodded. "I was trained in the policies, but not in the deeper work of examining my own biases. Training that tells you what not to do isn't the same as training that helps you understand why those biases exist and how to overcome them." Jerome added, "What we learned is that good intentions aren't enough. People can believe they're being fair while acting in ways that perpetuate unfairness. The only way to change that is through honest conversation and the willingness to be uncomfortable with what we discover about ourselves." In the third row, Emma Rodriguez sat with her classmates, now 11 years old, and still possessed of the moral clarity that had cut through adult complications on that sidewalk. When Jerome opened the floor for questions, Emma's hand shot up immediately. "Agent Washington," she said, standing as she spoke, "do you think people are getting better at being fair?" Jerome smiled, remembering the 10-year-old who'd asked why police were being mean to a man who was just sitting down. "Emma, I think people are learning that fairness requires practice. Just like math or reading, we have to work at it every day." Emma nodded seriously. "And Mr. Blackwood, are you still practicing being fair?" Blackwood's expression softened as he looked at the child whose innocent questions had helped begin his transformation. "Every day, Emma. Every single day." The presentation continued with students asking thoughtful questions about justice, prejudice, and the possibility of change. Many had seen social media coverage of the original incident, but hearing directly from both men created a different kind of understanding. After the formal presentation ended, Jerome and Blackwood remained to speak with individual students, answering questions that were too personal for the group setting. A young black student approached Jerome privately. "Mr. Washington, has this ever happened to you before? Being accused of something you didn't do because of how you look?" Jerome considered his answer carefully. "Yes, it has. Many times. But this was the first time I had a badge that changed how it ended. That's why it's important for all of us to speak up when we see unfairness, because most people don't have badges to flash." Meanwhile, Blackwood found himself in conversation with a white student who seemed troubled by the implications of the story. "Mr. Blackwood, how do I know if I'm making assumptions about people?" "Start by listening more than you speak," Blackwood replied. "Ask yourself why you're thinking what you're thinking about someone. If you can't explain it based on their actual behavior, then you're probably dealing with assumptions rather than facts. As the auditorium emptied, Jerome and Blackwood walked together toward the parking lot, their relationship transformed from antagonist and victim into something approaching partnership in the work of education and reform. "Any regrets about doing these presentations?" Jerome asked as they reached their cars. Blackwood considered the question. "None about the presentations. Plenty about what led to them being necessary." Jerome nodded. "The kids seem to get it faster than adults do." "Maybe because they haven't learned to rationalize unfairness yet," Blackwood replied. "Emma still asks the most challenging questions." That evening, Jerome helped Zara with her homework at their kitchen table, the routine that had anchored them both through the difficult months following the incident and its aftermath. "Daddy," Zara said, "looking up from her science project, kids at school say you're famous now for teaching people about being fair." Jerome smiled. "Not famous, baby bird, just trying to help people understand each other better." "Like Emma did that day?" Zara asked, referring to the story she'd heard many times about the little girl whose questions had helped adults see clearly. "Exactly like Emma did," Jerome confirmed. "Sometimes the most important thing we can do is ask simple questions and expect honest answers." As Zara returned to her homework, Jerome reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon when he'd sat on a bench waiting to catch financial criminals, and instead found himself exposing something much more pervasive and challenging to address. The money laundering investigation had eventually resumed with different methods, but the work of changing assumptions and building understanding continued every day. The sidewalk across from First National Bank had returned to its normal rhythm of pedestrians and commerce, but something fundamental had shifted in the community's conversation about fairness and justice. Training programs had been implemented, policies had been revised, and most importantly, people had begun asking the kinds of questions that Emma Rodriguez had modeled simple, direct, and impossible to answer dishonestly. Change was slow, imperfect, and often frustrating, but it was happening one conversation at a time, guided by the moral clarity that children possessed naturally and that adults could reclaim through the hard work of honest self-examination. In communities across the country, similar conversations were beginning, sparked by a story about a federal agent, a police officer, and a 10-year-old girl who had reminded everyone that fairness should never be complicated to explain to a child. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Together we can build understanding one dialogue at a time.